When you're home alone, the silence should be comforting. But what if it's not? What if your phone starts answering questions you didn't ask? What if someone knocks on your window twice and then tries to crawl in? What if the sound in the attic isn't just old pipes, but something or someone breathing inches above you? These are real stories from people who were home alone and weren't. No ghosts, no urban legends, just pure human horror stalking, watching, waiting to strike when you're most vulnerable. After this, you'll never look at being alone the same way again. Siri knew my name. Sarah had the house to herself for the weekend. Her parents were visiting family in another state, and she had spent most of Saturday with her friend Mark. He had left just after dinner, and the large, quiet suburban home suddenly felt a lot bigger. The house was a good distance from the nearest neighbor, and the streetlights barely reached the driveway, leaving the place shrouded in darkness once the sun went down. Sarah was used to it, though. She had lived there her entire life. She decided to make it a relaxing night. She ordered a pizza, watched a few movies, and around midnight, feeling exhausted, she put her phone on her nightstand to charge and went to bed. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Sarah was a heavy sleeper, so when a voice jolted her awake, she was instantly disoriented. The voice was clean, synthetic, and unmistakably female. It was Siri. "Okay, I found that for you." Sarah's eyes snapped open. She sat up in bed, her heart thumping a confused rhythm. The phone screen was a glowing rectangle on her nightstand. She picked it up, and the familiar circular Siri icon was active on the display. She had no idea what it had responded to. Sarah just swiped out of the screen, chalking it up to a bizarre glitch. Maybe a rogue notification had triggered it, or a sound she made in her sleep. She was still half asleep and simply wanted to go back to bed. So she put the phone down, pulled the comforter to her chin, and drifted back to sleep. About an hour later, the voice woke her up again. This time, she was more alert and more afraid. The house felt suddenly colder. It was pretty freaky as hell, but I still ended up dismissing it as a glitch. Sarah sat up and stared at her phone, her breathing shallow. The words made absolutely no sense. It was as if the AI had misheard some kind of garbled sentence, but the phrase itself was so specific, so human. She stared at the phone in the dim light of her room, her mind racing. It didn't sound like anything from the movie she'd been watching. It sounded like a snippet of a conversation, but there was no one else in the house. The thought made a pit form in her stomach. She turned her phone on silent just in case, and placed it face down on the nightstand. She told herself that it was a simple technical malfunction, a weird, rare occurrence. A phone couldn't hurt her. She was wrong. Sarah finally managed to fall back into a fitful, light sleep, the kind where you were on high alert even in your dreams. The next time the voice woke her up, it wasn't the sound of the words that sent a jolt of pure terror through her. It was what those words were responding to. Here's the info for my name. Sarah's hand, shaking violently, reached for her phone. The screen was lit up, and she could see the search query plain as day. It was not a jumbled mess of words or a random string of letters. It was her full name, first, middle, and last. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Siri had responded to a request containing her full name. But who was asking? Sarah was alone. She had locked all the doors and the windows. The security system was armed. And yet, there it was, an undeniable piece of evidence that someone else was there. And they knew her name. The calm, robotic voice now sounded like the chillingly casual tone of an intruder. The fact that they had not made themselves known yet, that they were communicating through her phone, was infinitely more terrifying than an outright home invasion. It was a cruel, psychological game. She scrambled out of bed, her mind a blur of panic. She didn't bother grabbing her shoes or a jacket. She clutched her phone, ran out of her bedroom, and sprinted down the hallway to her parents' room. Her hands trembled so much she could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, she fumbled with the bolt and slid it home, leaning against the cold wood of the door, breathing heavily as if she had just escaped a physical pursuit. She stayed there for the rest of the night, huddled under a blanket with a baseball bat she had found in the closet, the phone clutched tightly in her hand. The glow of the screen felt like a beacon in the darkness, and every creak of the house made her jump. Her parents, when they returned, laughed it off. They suggested that she must have been sleepwalking and her face or voice had accidentally triggered the phone. But Sarah knew better. She knew she hadn't sleepwalked, and she knew that the voice and the words were not her own. She got a new phone a week later, but the memory still haunts her. To this day, when she is alone in her room at night, she can't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone that night, and that whoever was in the house with her is still out there, just waiting for the next opportunity to get in. Knocks from the void. Alex considered himself the classic non-confrontational gamer. His world was his room, his headset, and the glowing screen of his PC. He lived with his family, but on this particular night, they were all out of town, leaving him with a wide-open Saturday and a long list of games to play. The suburban house was quiet, insulated from the outside world by thick glass and the hum of the heater. It was the middle of winter, and the cold snap had wrapped the neighborhood in an extra layer of silence. Around 2 in the morning, right as Alex was in the middle of a tense in-game confrontation, a sound cut through the artificial noise of his headset. It was a knock, a distinct, steady knock that came from his window. Alex's head snapped around, his eyes wide. His room was on the first floor, but his window faced the secluded backyard, which was surrounded by a high wooden fence. He wasn't sure what to think. A prank? But who would bother in the dead of winter at 2 in the morning? He pushed his chair back and leaned toward the window, peering through the slight gap in the blinds. The backyard was a black void. The moonlight, what little there was, didn't illuminate the space. He didn't see a shadow, a figure, or anything at all. Assuming it was just some kids messing around, he pulled the blinds all the way shut, a quiet and non-confrontational way of telling whoever was out there that he wasn't interested. He turned back to his game, a little shaken but confident that his message had been received. Enough time passed that the first knock started to fade from his memory. Alex got back into the rhythm of his game, his focus fully on the digital world. He was relaxed again, the earlier incident forgotten. Then came the second round of knocks. This time, they were more deliberate, slower, but louder. The sound was a rhythmic rap, rap, rap against the glass, an unwavering repetition that seemed to demand his attention. A cold, heavy feeling settled in Alex's stomach. The earlier knocks might have been a prank, but this was different. This felt intentional. The playful nature was gone, replaced by a quiet, insistent presence that was now making his skin crawl. A paranoid chill ran through him as he thought, "Why are they doing this? Why can't they just leave me alone?" His mind raced through the possibilities. Who would be out there? He wanted to ignore it, to prove he wasn't interested. But a nagging thought kept bothering him. What if, by the slimmest chance, they actually needed help? What if there was a real emergency and he was ignoring it? The thought was enough to make him act. Against his better judgment, he walked over to the window, lifted the blinds, and pulled the lock. He pushed the window up, just a crack, barely a few inches, just enough to see if he could hear a voice or a call for help. That was the biggest and most foolish mistake he had ever made. Before he could even whisper a question, 2 hands shot out of the darkness and grabbed the bottom of the window. They were gloved, and they gripped the frame with a frightening amount of force. The window was ripped open and shoved all the way up, creating a gap large enough for a person to enter. Alex's blood ran cold. The shadow he couldn't see before now materialized into the terrifying silhouette of a hooded man dressed in all black, who began to hoist himself up and into the room. Alex didn't have time to process the fear. The sheer shock of it triggered a primal fight-or-flight response. He started screaming, a high-pitched, panicked shriek that was drowned out by the muffled sounds of the man grunting as he tried to pull himself through the window. Alex began to throw punches, wild, frantic blows aimed at the hooded head and the arms that were still holding onto the sill. The man didn't seem to care. His focus was only on getting inside. Alex felt a surge of adrenaline, his heart hammering against his ribs. He He scanned his desk for anything, his eyes landing on a small, heavy desk lamp. Without a second thought, he grabbed it by the base and swung, a desperate, full-body motion. The lamp's glass shade shattered against the man's head with a sickening thud. The man froze, a short, involuntary noise escaping his lips, and then his grip slipped. He fell backward, out of sight. That was all Alex needed. He slammed the window shut with all his strength, fumbling with the lock until it clicked into place. He then ran to his door and locked that too. A frantic double security effort. Trembling, he peeked through the blinds again. He saw the hooded figure, now holding the side of his head, get up and run, disappearing into the darkness of the yard. Alex spent the rest of the night barricaded in his room, a cold sweat covering his body. He never told his parents what happened, not wanting them to worry or dismiss it as a prank. To this day, the memory of those two gloved hands snaking out of the darkness still haunts him. He no longer feels safe with his blinds open, and every time he hears an unexplained noise at night, his heart lurches, and a single terrifying question echoes in his mind. Was it the same guy? And what if he comes back? Something on the roof. Jason had always loved the solitude of his home. It sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road, miles from the nearest neighbor. Cell service was a distant dream, and the silence at night was so profound, it felt like a living thing. For a man who enjoyed his own company, it was the perfect existence. But that night, the silence was shattered by a sound that made his blood run cold. It was late, a little after 11 p.m., and the house was pitch black except for the glow of the television. The night was still, with no wind, so when a loud crash sounded on his roof, Jason sat bolt upright on the couch. He paused his movie, his head cocked to the side, listening. After a moment, another noise followed, a metallic clang that reverberated through the house. It sounded like something had hit their metal chimney with significant force. Jason's first thought was to rationalize it. A branch could have broken off a nearby tree, or maybe an animal had gotten onto the roof. He tried to tell himself it was nothing and unpaused his movie, but the thought of a fallen tree branch didn't explain what came next. For the next hour, a steady, rhythmic banging echoed from the chimney. It wasn't a random thumping. It was a deliberate, consistent percussion that seemed to be coming from inside the chimney. The sound was impossible, and the impossibility was what made it so terrifying. Jason knew the chimney was covered with a metal cap for the summer, so there was no way anything could have gotten in. Yet the sounds continued, a persistent and unnerving rhythm that grew louder and louder. Then the banging from the chimney stopped. Jason held his breath, listening. The silence was heavier than before, almost suffocating. He thought maybe whatever it was had left and a tense sense of relief washed over him. But that relief was short-lived. A new sound began, this time from the front door. It was the distinct rattling of the doorknob, followed by the deep groan of the lock as if something on the other side was pulling and tugging, trying to get inside. Jason froze. He crept silently to the door, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He pressed his eye to the peephole, a tiny lens offering a sliver of the world outside. He stared into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the black void of the country night. He looked down at the handle, which was still rattling and shaking as if it was being violently twisted from the other side. The sounds were coming from a physical presence, but he couldn't see it. This was the moment the fear transcended simple panic and became a cold, paralyzing dread. The banging in the chimney, the shaking door, whatever it wasn't a prank. It knew he was home, and it was trying to get in. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, frozen in terror, unable to move. But then, a moment of sudden, desperate clarity broke through his fear. He wasn't going to just stand there and wait. He would confront it, whatever it was. He was going to take back control. With a sharp, sudden motion, he reached for the lock, threw it back, and swung the heavy front door wide open. In that instant, everything stopped. The rattling of the door, the imagined thumping from the chimney, all of it ceased at once. The world outside was plunged into an eerie and profound silence. Jason stood in the open doorway, peering into the darkness. There was no one on his porch, no one lurking in the trees, nothing at all. Just a quiet, empty night. He slowly pulled the door shut and locked it, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the key. The night was over, but the quiet that had once brought him comfort now only brought terror. He still lives out in that same house, but he never takes the silence for granted. To this day, he has no idea what was trying to get inside, and the terrifying knowledge that it could come back at any time is the real horror that has stayed with him ever since. The thing in the attic. Kyle lived in a quiet suburban home with his family. The living room had a massive 2-story vaulted ceiling, which meant that the only room directly above it was the attic. It was a hot, quiet summer day, and Kyle was home alone, enjoying the cool comfort of the air conditioning while watching a movie. The house was still, wrapped in a peaceful silence that was soon shattered by a sound from above. It was a soft, shuffling noise. At first, Kyle dismissed it. He told himself it was just the house settling or the sounds of the ducks in the ceiling. But the sound continued, a distinct dragging and shuffling. He lowered the volume on the television, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He could now hear it clearly, the sound of faint footsteps, as if someone was dragging their feet across the wooden floorboards above him. It was a chilling sound, made all the more unnerving because he knew the attic was empty. The attic was only accessible through a small latched door hidden in the back of his older brother's closet. Kyle crept down the hall, his stomach in knots. He went into the closet and unlatched the door, pulling it down and revealing the dark square of the attic entrance. The small pull-string light inside was broken, so he grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. He only made it 2 steps into the attic before everything inside him screamed at him to stop. The weak, dusty floorboards groaned under his weight, but a second later, a new creak echoed a few feet away, as if someone else had shifted their weight. Then came the sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The unmistakable scritch of something brushing against one of the large plastic bags full of old clothes that were stored in the attic. The sound was deliberate, and it was close. He jumped back out of the attic like a shot, yanking the door shut and sliding the bolt home with a trembling hand. He stood there, his back pressed against his brother's closet door, breathing heavily, before running to the phone and calling his parents. His dad had a look in there when he got home, but he didn't find anything, just the dusty storage space they had left. Kyle was relieved, but a chilling thought stayed with him long after. The attic was directly connected to his brother's room, not his own. He felt lucky, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that he had been in the presence of someone who had no business being there. Breathing behind the wall. Daniel was excited about the move. The house wasn't anything impressive, just a modest little bungalow perfect for 1 or 2 people, but it was his. He spent the first few days unpacking and getting settled, and right away, he noticed something strange. He heard sounds coming from inside the walls, a low scuffling and a soft scratching like something was moving around just behind the drywall. He first heard it in the kitchen, then in the bathroom, but on the 3rd night, he heard it in his bedroom. He immediately chalked it up to an animal, probably a squirrel or a raccoon that had gotten inside the walls. He'd deal with it later. He just had to figure out how to get rid of it. Over the next few days, the mystery continued, but in a different way. Daniel noticed his food seemed to be disappearing faster than it should. The first time he noticed it was in the morning. He went to pour a bowl of cereal and didn't have enough milk to fill the bowl. He couldn't believe he'd forgotten to buy more, but shrugged it off as an oversight. In fact, it seemed he was eating through all of his groceries at an accelerated rate. He thought it was just the stress of moving making him hungrier than usual. That night, Daniel was jolted awake in the middle of the night. The sound was distinct and chillingly familiar, the soft rhythmic breathing of a person. It wasn't his own. He lay completely still, his heart a frantic drum in the darkness. He flipped his lamp on, and the breathing stopped instantly. The room was silent. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that his mind was playing tricks on him after being startled awake. He was tired and stressed, and that was that. He turned the lamp off and went back to sleep. The next day was unseasonably hot, so Daniel turned on his AC for the first time. The house cooled down slowly, and he noticed that some of the vents weren't blowing any air, one of them being the vent on the wall right next to his bed. He figured the ducts just needed to be cleaned out, but a nagging curiosity made him grab a flashlight. He knelt down and shined the beam through the tiny slits in the vent. It wasn't a duct at all. The air conditioning unit had been removed at some point, and all that was left was a dark, hollow cavity in the wall. A chill ran down his spine. He had to assume the previous owner hadn't disclosed the broken AC system. That night, with no air conditioning, Daniel was up late, constantly rolling around and flipping his pillow over. The heat was stifling, and the silence of the night felt heavy and menacing. Then, in the midst of his restlessness, he heard it again, the breathing, but this time, he was wide awake. The sound was unmistakably real. It was coming from the left side of his bed. His eyes shot over to the vent. The sound was definitely coming from in there. He froze, a wave of pure terror washing over him. He knew now that it wasn't a hallucination. He grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand again and, with a trembling hand, shined it through the vent. He dropped it and screamed. There was someone's face peering back at him from inside the wall. The first thing he saw were two wide-open, glowing eyes, their gaze fixated directly on his. They were surrounded by the grimy face of a man, his features distorted by the narrow cracks of the vent. The man wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound. He was just watching. Daniel scrambled backwards, screaming all the way down the hall and out the front door, not stopping until he was on the lawn, staring back at his dark house in pure terror. He later found out from the previous owner that he had been in a prolonged legal battle with a transient person who he had caught squatting in the house. He had been so desperate to sell it that he had hidden the problem. A crazy, dangerous homeless man had been living in his walls, and he had been eating Daniel's food ever since he moved in. The knowledge that he was never alone, that someone had been silently watching him, is a feeling that has never left him.